Welcome, everyone, to Special Education Legal Fund's January webinar on schools and evaluations. We have a great panel for you tonight, and we are really excited to get started. My name is Christine Lai, and I am Executive Director and Co-Founder of Special Education Legal Fund. First of all, I would be remiss if I did not, spend a couple minutes thanking our sponsors and partners without whom this this panel series, the Parent Education Program, and much of what we do itself would not be possible. We'd like to thank our gold sponsors, Winston Preparatory School and WealthSpire Advisors, our silver level sponsors, American School for the Deaf, Fusion Academy, Shrub Oak International School, Villa Maria School, and Chapel Haven Schleifer Center, and our bronze sponsors, Eagle Hill School and the Windward School. So thank you to all of you for your the depth and the breadth of your friendship and support for SELF. For those of you that don't know us, I'd just like to say a couple of words about SELF before we begin. Special Education Legal Fund was founded in 2018 to provide resources, knowledge, and support to families in need with children in the special education system. Since that time, we have provided over $550,000 in grants for legal support to hundreds of families across 60 school districts in Connecticut and Westchester County, New York. We have two grants programs that we run for families here at SELF, the Legal Assistance Program and the Advocacy Support Program. The Legal Assistance Program is a program that provides families that need an attorney with $5,000 of support so they can access a qualified special education attorney. The Advocacy Support Program provides families in need with $1,000 in advocacy support from a qualified non-attorney advocate. Each of these programs runs on a monthly basis, which means we accept applications, review them, and notify families on a monthly basis. Our January review cycle is just concluding now, but we are accepting applications for the February cycle. I just want to point out, I thought about it tonight, that we actually have only 4 grant cycles left this academic year: February, March, April, and May. This year, we are going to close our grant cycle a little bit early because my son's graduating from high school, and there's a whole big hullabaloo around that. So that's what we are doing this year. We're running 4 more grant cycles. And if you're interested in applying, please visit our website. The URL is at the bottom of the screen. It's www.spedlegalfund.org. Apply for grant, and you can, access it in there. Next up, our February webinar is what is outplacement? This is a very popular webinar that we've run, pretty much since we started doing this, featuring special education attorneys Jeff Forte, Terry Bedard, and Meredith Braxton. This is a great, interesting, topical, topic that really is crucial for parents that are kind of navigating this process and looking for what might be an appropriate placement for their child. So please remember to join us. You can register through the same link that you used for this. It's February 8th at 7 o'clock. All right, so we are first up, this is Christy's 4th appearance on our webinar series. See, I told you that I counted earlier today, and we are super excited to welcome her back. Christy has previously appeared on our legal fund panels to discuss residential schools, approved and non-approved schools, and post-secondary transition. I think I got them all. Her expertise is wide-ranging, and tonight she's going to help us understand how schools like Chapel Haven use evaluations in the admissions and programming process. So welcome back, Christy. Next up is Bill DeHaven. Welcome, Bill. Bill comes to us from Villa Maria School in Stamford, where he's head of school, having joined Villa Maria in 2020, I think it is, after over 20 years at Winston Preparatory School's New York campus in a variety of roles, but the last of which was head of school, which he was for over a dozen years. Bill is a longtime and dear friend of SELF's and a member of our board of directors, and this is his third outing for us on a panel. You also did approved and non-approved schools, and maybe in the COVID era or something like that. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Next panelist is Lauren Koffler from Shrub International School. Lauren is obviously a repeat customer of our panels as well. Lauren brings more than a decade of experience in education to her role as head of admissions and communication at Shrub International School. And we've had Lauren before on a residential school panel on a variety of different explorations that we've done as part of this education series. And we are really, really grateful and happy to have her back tonight. Next up is Paula Morabito. We are really excited to welcome Paula back to our parent education webinar series. Paula is the Assistant Executive Director at the ASD 1817, the American School for the Deaf in Hartford. And she has, as such in that role, has responsibility for the great breadth and depth of all the programming that happens at, ASD, at American School for the Deaf. This is Paul, I think this is your second webinar. Having previously joined us to discuss approved and non-approved schools. And we're really excited to welcome you back tonight. Finally, last but not least, we are incredibly blessed to welcome Beth Sugerman back to our webinar panel series. Beth has been head of Winston Prep in Norwalk since, I think, 2007. And she's been a significant partner in the journeys of so many families in the New York and Connecticut region, including my own. This is particularly significant for me this year because my son, who's graduating from high school, spent, several of his formative years and what I consider to be his transformative years at Winston Prep in Norwalk. So, a lot of Beth is a longtime friend and partner of SELF. And some of you may know she was the first person I went to when SELF was not a thing. It was still an idea. She's been a guest of more panels and webinars than I can remember. I actually didn't bother to count them. And we're really excited to welcome her back this evening. Because it would not be a webinar panel without a disclaimer, I'm going to go ahead and read this for you. This webinar panel is presented for informational purposes only. This webinar is intended as a resource for families who are navigating the special education system in Connecticut and New York, and is not intended to provide legal support, advice, or assistance to any particular individual, nor is it intended to replace the advice and counsel of a qualified special education attorney. Families in need of legal advice, support, or assistance should contact a special education attorney licensed to practice in Connecticut or New York to discuss the specific needs of their individual student. This webinar should not be construed as an endorsement by Special Education Legal Fund or any of its representatives of any of the participating attorneys, advocates, other professionals in the panel, nor should it be construed as an endorsement of any school or school representative invited to appear on this panel. That was quite a mouthful. So here we go. Schools and evaluations. So I'm really excited for this topic, actually, because, I think of the evaluation as one of the most important pieces of any student's educational journey. It is the roadmap to a child's journey, and a good evaluation, at least, in my view, is what tells you where a child is and where they can go. So, at SELF, we use evaluations during, our grants review process in a number of different ways. But, mostly we like to look at them because for us, most of the time, they provide a third-party view of a child and, and a child's experience and their learning profile. I think that most of you are, if not all of you, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of you, if not all of you, require a neuropsychological evaluation as part of the admissions process. Can we start out by talking a little bit about what you're looking for? What are you looking at in a neuropsych when you first get that, that report as part of a student's file when you're looking at them for admission? Who wants to go for it first? Lauren is raising her hand.
Sure. So I think for us, safety and security, we are a residential facility. Safety and security is the most important thing for us. So when we look at it, if we see bolting, unsafe behavior on the internet. Those are not things that we can take, but we want to make sure that there are things that we can take and keep the students safe. And then on top of that, from an admissions perspective, it's whether or not we can have them progress. So to us, it's safety and security first, and then it's whether or not we can move them along in their journey to making progress.
I think for us and all of us on the screen, it is a driving force of, are we a solution to the problem that is bringing you to us? We take a look at that neuropsych, we look at the cognitive information, the achievement testing, social emotional development, and that then at least provides us the data and the professional foundation of understanding a child and whether or not they would be the proper fit within our program. And as Lauren said, that so that we can help. Is this the right fit? I think the folks that are here this evening, there's obviously something that, isn't working. So you're looking for the right place, and everyone on the screen works at, some pretty amazing transformative institutions and facilities and settings, but it's always, we all have our own niche. So those neuropsych evals, that assessment really, I think, provides each of us the information as to, is this the right fit for who we are, so that we can provide that support and assistance that your child needs.
And the reports are really important because the reports often lead to labels, and labels often lead to the services that our kids need. But a label doesn't help explain why our kids are struggling. So we're using that report to help better understand why our kids are struggling. Where are the gaps? Looking at, Beth talked about the cognitive battery, and looking at the gaps between the scores in the verbal comprehension versus something like the processing speed and the working memory. Where can we identify where the breakdown in learning is, so we can better understand a kid, so they can better design what the curriculum will look like. So we're really going to take a look. I think we on the screen will take a more thoughtful look at what those neuropsychs present. Then unfortunately, that great public and private schools, like, this is great, but they don't have the time to have the resources to take an in-depth look beyond what a label is. Mm-hmm. And when you've got something like a language-based learning disability, even things like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, they're labels and they don't help explain why a kid is struggling.
I think for me, it's like the beginning of a story. So it's usually the very first thing I look at after I've had a conversation with the family. And I think of it as like a puzzle framework almost that I'm building. So I'm like kind of getting the outline together. And then as I learn more about the student, I'm starting to plug in those other pieces by looking at the IEP and by asking follow-up questions and reference calls and meeting the student. And all of that begins to build together to, present the big picture of who this young person is and the types of supports that they might need. It's definitely so much more than a number. That's not all that we're looking for by any means. And in fact, I think a really great evaluation is one that gives the why behind the numbers, because a number can be look the same, but mean very different things based on how that was achieved.
Or the number may have changed over time, so it's important to get the progression as well.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to piggyback on Christy, because I completely agree. I did an interview today for a kiddo who had a full scale IQ of 57, but he didn't. And him and I had a full conversation. His processing speed was really slow, and it took time. But I think that at least when I look at kiddos and I see the paperwork and the IEP or the neuropsych, I take it with kind of a grain of salt, because I really or my team tries to dive into what they're doing at school and who they are at home, because I think that a lot of kids can't test. And I think that's really important to note. So, he definitely had a higher IQ than 57. So
Paula, how does American School for the Deaf use this in your process?
So I was waiting to hear how all of you are going to respond. And I'm a little bit jealous that you all have that as part of your admissions process. to try to find a neuropsychologist who can do it in a student who is deaf or hard of hearing in their L1 in their first language of ASL is, so we have, when we do an admissions process, we have to take the pieces, and how nice that is. So that would be to have a full neuropsych and the whole, the whole story in one. So that is really nice, but I have to say it's fairly rare in our population we have to, seek out of the state actually to find a neuropsych that could do that in ASL in their first languge.
Oh, wow.
So I'm jealous of all of
Yeah,
you.
no, that's
You
a
have that
real
whole story. Right there.
it's like every time I do one of these things, I know I learn something new, and that's a huge gap. That's an enormous, gap in services that I wasn't aware of. Well, maybe you can, kind of, kick off our next question. How do you use, an IEP in that sense when you're beginning the, the intake process, the admissions process, and then everybody else can kind of chime in on how the IEP, what you're getting from the evaluation that is different from the, from the IEP.
Right. So when we go through our admissions process and we look through the existing evaluations as well as the IEP, it really does help us in placement and what an appropriate classroom would be. We have a full variety of classrooms that they could go into. So we want to make sure that it's an appropriate fit, as well as, what is their current language level? And that's a big one for us. Do they have some spoken English and, so they could go into a spoken English classroom? Is it going to be a bilingual approach with spoken English and spoken English and ASL? So the IEP really does give us, a starting point for placement and, where that student or how that student was doing and what they were doing in their previous school.
And how do you supplement that as you kind of go on through the process, not having the, the nice package of the neuropsych to look at?
Yeah, so it's kind of a piecemeal, right? So we'll get pieces of that puzzle through other evaluations over time. We'll also conduct some evaluations ourselves because it is we have a clinical
that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we do have a clinical psychologist here, school psychologists. And so we can do, a variety of testing ourselves. And, I think that that's also beneficial because again, very rare to have a clinical psychologist and school psychologists that are fluent in ASL. So that is a benefit, and we can get a true picture of how that student is functioning.
Great. I want to unpack some of your stuff later on, but who would like to go next on the question of the IEP versus the evaluation in the admissions process?
I can go next. I think that it's something that as a school that is an independent school, but state approved, all of my outplaced kids arrive with an IEP. And unfortunately, an IEP is often a district's best effort at offering a kid a cafeteria menu of options to help. There might be a para, there's pullouts for speech and language, there's pullouts for OT, there's pullouts for counseling, which, I look at Villa as the accommodation. And so we have 30 days to kind of rewrite that IEP. And as an independent school, we'll look at that first. But then create what based on the neuropsych. What is our best understanding of a kid? And then to be able to write our own program, which we then turn into our own IEP, which then the districts kind of embrace. And especially for our outplaced kids, it becomes their IEP. So it's unfortunately, some districts do their best to try and put something together and it just isn't enough or is so piecemeal in a kid's day that there's nothing integrated in that plan. And that's why so many of our kids are not successful in a public school.
Not to interject, but William, I completely agree. So for us, at least as Shrub Oak, we work off the IEP or their designated IEP, and we always guarantee services with understanding that they might not be the complete services, and then we evaluate over the first 90 days. So I just had, for example, a kiddo whose family said to me, you know, we've never been assessed for O or PT. Can we do that? And, you know, I completely understand that PTOT kind of blurred lines, at least from what I've seen with New York City IEPs. And we ended up assessing the kid and they're getting OT, PT, and speech. So I feel like with IEPs, they're kind of the skeletal version, at least for us in our program, with what we look at. The neuropsych for us sheds a little bit more light, and then we kind of go through our admissions process.
Perfect.
I
Christy?
usually look at the IEP to be closer in time, you know, because often the evaluations are only happening every few years. And so usually the IEP is a way for me to say, okay, this is what this looked like 2 years ago. Here's what the IEP from this year
Currently,
is
yeah.
saying, you know, so kind of looking for some trends, things that have stayed consistent, and maybe areas, you know, where we've seen growth as well. And I think very similar to what Bill and Lauren have shared too, that, you know, it's a starting point. So if a student is accepted into our program and they are placed through a local school district, it's definitely a starting point for us, you know, and then we are doing our assessments and making revisions, you know, to the goals and objectives, because our program is quite different in terms of the independent living skills that we're developing and the vocational and things like that sometimes aren't as focused on maybe in some of the traditional school settings.
Yeah, absolutely. That would not, a lot of the stuff that you are working on wouldn't be necessarily in your run-of-the-mill IEP, because they wouldn't necessarily be focused on, you know, activities of daily living or whatever, you know, even if they should. Beth?
Well, Winston, we actually consider ourselves so diagnostic, and you know, back to that neuropsych evaluation and all of the information required, the achievement testing, social emotional, we develop our own plan. We don't refer to the IEP. We are, as I said, we just consider ourselves diagnostic and have a sense of what skills are missing. As Bill said, you know, let's investigate the difference between the fluid reasoning and what's happening with the working memory, and why is the verbal comprehension high? Why is the processing speed low? So what skills are the students missing? Is the student missing? So that's how we develop our goals and objectives, is through our understanding of that neuropsych evaluation. School records, we look at school records, we look at speech and language evaluations, we look at, you know, whatever information we can get, we take as much data as we can. But, you know, that IEP is a computerized document that, you know, is a little, and, you know, it's just, whereas we develop a narrative of the student's needs, and Christine, you know this from personal experience, and that's how we formulate a child's plan. And we, you know, assess, understand, develop a skill-based program, and then we respond to the child's response in a much faster manner than an IEP in a typical conventional setting would be responsive, right? It was that once a year a meeting, or if a meeting is called for.
Yeah.
But so we're always evaluating and responding to a child's response.
Yeah. Well, all of you, I know, and this is important to, you know, to point out, all of you in each one of your individual environments, no matter how different they are responding, you know, really in real time to the changing needs of the student, you know, whether it's on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. I know all of you are kind of getting together with your teams, you know, on that, you know, that regular weekly-ish schedule, and working together, communicating with the parent, and, you know, and tracking, you know, the things that you might need to tweak or not tweak, or what's working well or what's not. And that, I think, is a real, you know, is a real benefit of, you know, the placements that, you know, at a Winston, at a Villa, at a Chapel Haven, at a Shrub Oak, you know, at an American School for the Deaf, which are that, you know, you are able to make those dynamic changes, which is, you know, which is a tremendous benefit, you know, for the student and the family, honestly. I mean, like that kind of responsiveness really builds trust with the family and the team. And it's something that, you know, as a parent, I know that I really, really value. You know, let's, you know, I wanted to, you know, step back a little bit, you know, on the evaluation. You know, the neuropsych is obviously, you know, an expensive proposition for, you know, for a lot of families. You know, I mean, you know, obviously sometimes you can get your school district to, you know, to provide one for you, but, you know, that's gotten harder these days, you know, so what types of evaluations, you know, like really carry more weight with you? Do you, would you accept a school-based neuropsych evaluation? Is a speech and language evaluation going to be okay for what you're looking at? I mean, I just love to hear like what kinds of, because I know a lot of families find, the full neuropsych evaluation to be something that, in many cases is not attainable, so are there other ways, other ways in which, you can glean the information that you need?
Great question.
Who wants to go? Oh, Lauren wants to go.
I want to go, but I will go. I love a good neuropsych. I think that, when comparing it to an IEP, it's really insightful. That being said, I completely understand, the fiscal, implication of it. If you were to do it outside of the district, and the implication of it if you were to do it within the district. So for us, as much as I like it, I think that at least for us in the admissions process, talking to the teachers or the private providers, the parents, we do it very intentionally and very separately, is really important to us. And again, like I want to emphasize, at least from our program, we see paperwork all the time. I saw a kid with a 57 IQ today. He wasn't, he was way higher than that, and fully engaged and fully on social media. So for us, I've made a very distinct, decision in our program to not have an IQ cutoff. So for us, it's really not about the paperwork. It's about knowing the student and kind of having the person who will best represent that child in real time to understand then how they can fit into our program.
And to piggyback Lauren's comment, exactly, getting that outside support and those teachers or specialists that are working with the child to give that feedback. The neuropsych is very important, but we also have to remember it's a measure that was taken over 5 or 6 days.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That's why, we look at it and we understand, and it's
as opposed to a full year.
Sorry,
like a full year,
Yeah, no, right. It's 5 days. It's a test that's taken over 5 or 6 days.
Yeah.
So, it's certainly utilized as a guideline, but we do have to understand how the brain works. All of those sub-measures are, valuable, and how each lobe is working, and the left lobe, the right, the language center of the brain, the conceptual center of the brain, the executive function, frontal lobe, but so we do need to have that understanding. But a speech and language evaluation certainly is important. I'm an SLP, so I love to dig into those. And also, as Lauren said, speaking with the professionals in the child's world to give that fuller picture.
I think the thing that's not helpful is the psychological evaluation that's like 4 pages long, where it's literally lists the number, and it says, and this is the number for this category. And then at the end it says, and these are the numbers for each.
This is above average. This is
it's
average.
like, okay, well, that's not super helpful. So, but, the thing that we're ultimately looking for is we do want to understand, cognitive measures and kind of understand how that learning profile comes together. We want to see information about social and emotional measures so that we can understand, anxiety, depression, any types of behaviors that might be involved there. And the adaptive skills, we want to understand what those day-to-day living skills look like. And so that can come as part of a really great comprehensive full neuropsych evaluation, but it can also come by piecemealing a few different things together and then supplementing that, as the others have said, with reference calls and additional measures. We do love to see speech language evaluations. I'm often surprised how often we don't see those, because we do find those to be really helpful, especially in our ASAP program, where the social communication piece is often the crux of what's needed there.
Yeah, those can be really, really like just amazingly detailed and helpful in, in understanding the way a child communicates. So, that's tremendous.
In general, I think they're probably, this is not to say anything about any, psychologist, neuropsychologist writing an evaluation, but the speech and language evaluations overall are the most clinical, they're the most thoughtful, they give a lot of information. But we do require that neuropsych, and often the families only option is to rely on the district, and the district have to give them that neuropsych. And you're right that there's sometimes, Christy's right, they're just numbers sometimes. But I think going back to Christy's comment in the very beginning, they tell a story. So if we can learn to tell our own story just based on the assessment data, because I may tell a very different story than a really poorly written evaluation, but it has the test scores. So I at least can see where the kid tests. But to Beth's point, it's a snapshot of a kid. So it's not going to be completely accurate. We always have to take that with, in context of all of these other pieces. So the more information a family can bring to the table, these outside evaluations are often important, especially if you're receiving outside speech services. That evaluation, that information from that speech and language pathologist is always really important and helpful.
And I echo what everybody has said. Those are all critical pieces of information, but I love what Lauren's said and her example, and just meeting with the student as well as part of that admissions evaluation process, right? Bringing the student in and connecting with that student. And sometimes the numbers may not show us the full picture. And Lauren, that was a great example.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No.
For us, we are a day in residential facility, and, the years go by. I've been here since the beginning, and I think that testing is really important. And I got an amazing evaluation today, like a neuropsych from 2023. It was the best report, best recommendation. It was
Text me later. Yeah,
it was
tell me
from a psychologist in Utah. It was like,
oh,
I was like, can you do all of them?
Everyone. Yeah.
But then you meet the child, and it might be different. This instance, it was in line. But for us, I think that, at least for me running the department, I've said it before on other, webinars with you, Christine, we don't do an IQ cutoff because I don't believe that students can test necessarily. And while I hold a lot of value to these documents, and I think it's really important for me, at least at Shrub Oak, it's really speaking to the teachers and the parents and really understanding who the child is, because I don't actually believe that you can necessarily test. You might have a bad day.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I always feel like, the neuropsych happens during a moment of crisis, so like, how it, because you're trying to figure out what's going on, you have no idea, you're bouncing between all these appointments that, you're getting called, picking up the kid from school all the time. It's like, it's a time of crisis. How well is the child going to test in a time of crisis? I remember I was like, I just like to have a neuropsych where we weren't freaking out about something, like, I think that was like number 4, it wasn't like 1, 2, or 3, so, it's like, what does the child look like, in that like very, kind of, worked up state that they're in when this thing is happening. And is it
I'm sorry, but sitting across from a stranger.
Yeah.
Under testing conditions, which is not their fate. So it is the makeup of the situation is that much more challenging. But I think and all of us, when we do meet students and potential candidates for the school, I think that we really, sometimes we'll do a little more testing, which is part of our admissions process.
I was going to ask that about all of you, is kind of like, what if you do that,
Yeah, we kind of delve into whatever the neuropsych makes us question, right? And something we wish to learn a little bit more about. But parents will sometimes say, oh, but they've had so much. And I say, well, we just do a little more because we want to see how that child responds to that situation, right? What is the level of anxiety? What is their processing speed, as Lauren pointed out, right? What is their, do they plan? Is there any planning? We have a written task. So do they sit and outline? Do they think about it, or do they just sit and write? So that sitting across from a child, and as much as a really good neuropsych will have those observations, it's still not the same as when they're in your environment. Right. And it's different, which we try to make a little bit more comfortable, but that also too is, and atypical situation for a child, right? Again, here's a stranger, I'm a different school. So we always have to take that into consideration. Some students are certainly more comfortable than others, but sitting across from a student is just so informative.
Yeah.
Well, and to that, not to hug, but for us, we're day in residential. So it's a very big difference if you're going home every day, and then,
Right.
or
If you're
you
living
are,
in the,
you're
immersed in
living there. Yeah. I mean, and again, Christine, you said, the anxiety of testing. My daughter had a neuropsych. She was sitting in front of a stranger. She had no idea who he or they were.
Yeah.
And I
my
consider
son
that,
kicked an examiner, so.
I consider that in the process. And I
Yeah.
truly believe that as much as, listen, paperwork is paperwork. I think that you can't disregard it, but I think that you also have to, at least for us, we do a lot of digging with the school or the private provider or the parents separately to understand the child as a whole. I mean, at least that's important.
Yeah.
I do
for
think
me
it
in
is
our
really,
program.
yeah, I do think it is really helpful to see, and a good neuropsych will have this in there. Like you mentioned, the testing behaviors, but often woven in there too. It's like, oh, we couldn't get all the way through this
Right.
test because they got frustrated and they shut
Right.
down, or, they were struggling at first, but then they really picked it up. And then, they were making these comments as they
The
went around.
narrative is
These
so
are
important.
Good
Yeah.
little hidden gems
Yeah.
in there that do a lot of revealing, that aren't necessarily a formal part of the intro or the summary at the end.
Mhm. Paula, you alluded to this, before, and so did you, Beth, in terms of like testing that you conduct on your own, as either part of the admissions process or just after the student is admitted. How many of you do that? And is it something that you kind of pull through the student's experience at your school for tracking? Is that or goal development or whatever? How many of you do that as part of your process?
We don't do formal, like standardized testing measures, but we have our own assessment that we do that's
Mhm.
really where the rubber meets the road, right? So
Yeah.
you get to spend a week there, living there. We're looking at your ability to get up in the morning and
Oh,
brush your
wow, a
teeth
week.
and
Yeah.
take your showers and make your meals. And we do a full written report based on everything that we learn about the student during the visit. And that does form the basis for our beginning goals and objectives. And then that's reviewed consistently throughout their time in the program, and then starts to correlate with our curriculum-based assessment.
Now, does that happen before admission or, so that's a part, so you could in theory, go through that process and, evidence, behaviors or, things that make, your program not suitable?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And even that, we actually had that happen back in December. There was a young woman who we had just learned as much as we could, and we really just needed to put her in our environment and see how
Mhm.
that went. And she ultimately was not ready for our program and wasn't accepted. But we had such great data to share with the family so that they could share that with their school district so that they knew exactly what they needed to work on. And we do give recommendations for ways to approach, developing some of those skills that might not have been there, at the time that we assessed them.
I'm a little bit jealous of that, of your ability to do that. That's probably
Yeah.
the ideal. But to your question, Christine, we do the battery that we use of all this. We do a bunch of the different kinds of formal and informal assessments, but part of the battery that we use is the same battery that we use to assess our kids every spring. So we have good data from the way in.
Right.
And years
No,
on.
that's so important, the benchmark and all of the different data points.
We do some language assessments, kind of assess where they are in their ASL development, their English development. We have a day in a residential therapeutic program for all of those students. We do an FBA once they enter here. We do that within the first 30 days. And then when we look at the evaluations that they come with, we will ask to repeat some of them. For example, I think we got a cognitive one time and we're reading through the narrative, and it was a psychologist who did the assessment of the deaf child, and the sister was the interpreter. So we kind of felt that was probably not the most accurate.
Ideal.
So we will repeat evaluations, if we feel that, we'd like some more valid results.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
I mean, we don't, we have very rarely assessed, clinically, as you asked. But for us, if someone comes in with a BIP, we will meet with the team if they're willing, the prior placement, and we will implement it knowing that our environment is very different maybe than the environment that they're coming from. And it might change, but yeah, I mean, I feel like, we do the best we can, but we definitely don't do formal assessments.
Okay. I mean, you bring up an interesting point about, kind of behaviors. Well, actually, you both brought up an interesting point about behaviors and an FBA, and a behavior plan. Is that kind of a red flag for you on the way in? Like if you see that in an evaluation, a neuropsych, or, in any kind of the narrative of a child, how does behavior, sort of impact the way you look at a potential student?
Not for us. For our therapeutic program, we expect that, but we also, when we kind of review that information, we're wondering if part of that behavior stemmed from a frustration of a lack of communication. And
or the existing environment, always, yeah.
I'll absolutely agree with that. I had a conversation with a family today from a kid who was outplaced, and in most initial outplacements from districts are kids with behavioral issues.
Right.
And this little boy did have behavioral issues, but we go back to the neuropsych testing. His gap between his processing speed and his, fluid reasoning and verbal comprehension, there was a 30 and a 40-point gap. So of course he was frustrated, and he was leaving the classroom every time he was frustrated. I don't think he was very well understood. So if you begin again to paint a picture and help understand, we have a pretty firm line about kids with emotional struggles, but so many of our kids are so frustrated and misunderstood in their environment. So we have to take a careful look at who they are and why they're struggling. And so it's a complete picture.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with William and, Paula, like for us, we are, at least our program, behaviors is something that we anticipate.
Yes, you do.
It's actually something that we completely embrace. So, for us, it's not scary. It's, are you in crisis all day long? And where is it coming from? And how can we help you? Whether it's the AAC device or, talk therapy or trauma therapy and things like that. So, it's more about keeping everyone safe and making progress, but to William and Paula's point, I think every program is very different. For at least my program, it is something that is completely anticipated and actually embraced. So.
And I think, we have to all consider the last few years and what kids have been through.
Yes.
We are at Winston Prep, we are students present with a primary learning disability. We're not a therapeutic setting, but we have, adolescents with learning challenges who are impulsive and have poor reasoning and judgment issues and expressive language issues. And so, you take that and you add in a global pandemic. And then you add in social media and the pressures of that. So, we're always looking at the whole child, and we always question, well, what is the primary challenge here? Is it social emotional, or is it a learning issue? Right. And I think everyone on the screen, I would say to our parents every day, we are the eternal optimists. Otherwise we wouldn't do what we do. But we always want to make sure that it's, a fit. And if a child needs more, then, that's something we also help the family, and, we'll counsel them to some other recommendations. And I think that's also, again, speaking to not just the neuropsych evaluation, but those people that work with, these are the kids that will one-to-one, they're wonderful. Well, yes, because they're being understood, because they're getting the support they need, because you're going at a pace that's comfortable for them. So that alone tells us, well, the public school says, as Bill mentioned today, a student has behavioral issues and they're leaving the classroom, or they're frustrated, or, Christine, I don't know if you know anybody like that, or who was once like that.
I definitely don't know anybody
but
like
never. So, but when a student's in an environment where, they feel understood and safe, and are learning in a style which is successful for them, then incredibly those behavioral issues disappear.
No, it's true.
Perhaps
It
not.
really is
all.
true. Nobody ever says when you have a plant that's like not, it's like dying, it's not flourishing. They're never like, what's wrong with the plant? You know, they're like, what's wrong with the soil? Is there enough water? Is there enough of light? But we look at the child and, you know, and very often, you know, we don't consider the environment, you know, that the behaviors are a reflection of the environment that the child is in. So that's, you know, a great point. And, you know, it's hard these last few years. You know, we have, you know, this is our, you know, this is our fifth year of providing grants. And, you know, and we've been, you know, blessed to kind of, you know, make it this far, you know, and make it through, you know, the global pandemic. But, you know, I look back on the kids that I used to see in our first year, you know, and those were like the kids that like just had dyslexia, you know, and now I don't have any kids like that. You know, I don't have any kids that are just something. They all have something plus something else, because whatever they were before the pandemic, it's worse. And then the pandemic layered on top of that anxiety and depression and every other thing, you know, that, you know, and the, you know, and the social, you know, delays and everything else on top of that. So, you know, it's harder and harder for you all to kind of do your job, you know, in that, you know, in that kind of environment, because you have to, you know, pick apart, you know, like what is the principal issue here? Or, you know, are there several principal issues? You
Chicken
know?
and egg. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, behavior's language, you know, it's child's language, you know, and they're trying to tell you something's not right, you know.
Trying to
And to
communicate
that-
something to us, yeah.
And to that point too, as Lauren was saying before with the day versus the residential piece, that's really helpful to see too, is like, are these things only happening at school? Are these only happening at home? Let's think about what the differences are in these two settings that might be, you know, reducing that or exacerbating that. So us also being a residential setting, that's an important piece that we consider too.
Absolutely, because it's not going to work if you don't have all of those different pieces, you know, together. How do you all use all of this stuff? You know, the evaluation, you know, the IEP, the testing that you've done, you know, in your, you know, in your initial, you know, admissions process. You know, you've admitted the child. How do you like go about the process of, you know, of setting goals for the student now that they're in your, you know, in your purview, they're in your care? You know, which pieces of this do you use, if any, to, you know, to set goals and objectives, you know, for want of a better phrase, for the students in your schools?
I think all of it just drives, you know, what are the cracks in a child's educational foundation? You know, what's impacting? We looking at that testing and saying, well, this is what's getting in the way: processing speed, fluid reasoning, language, visual, spatial recognition. So taking apart all that and just saying, well, you know, what skills are lacking in your child's educational experience to allow them to be successful. And then we fill in those blanks and we create a program that is skill driven and skill based. So that all that information, you know, from the neuropsych, from any other testing, from the parent conversation, from the student's interview, and then the team sits together and kind of says, okay, well, is this the right fit for who we are under the learning disabilities umbrella? And if so, what are the skills that this child needs in order to become a successful, independent individual? So all that information drives the goals and objectives.
I think for us too, so I do a summary of basically all these different reports that we've been talking about and kind of create like a little foundational cheat sheet, if you will, for our staff to help guide them with how to work through with the student as they're doing these different visits and assessments with us. And then that final assessment piece that I was talking about before, the week visit assessment, is just so great because it kind of pulls together all of those into, you know, concrete experiences that we can see and experience together with the student. And it informs everything from like the type of roommate they should have to should they be in a 2-bedroom versus a 3-bedroom, and, you know, who's going to need, you know, really explicit rules around grocery list and what is allowable, you know, based on their impulse control and the types of healthy choices that they're able to make for themselves. So that's all just super helpful. And then we do a review of it pretty quickly after the end of the first summer term. It's about first 45 days. We say, let's take a look at all of this again. Let's kind of tweak these and let's take it forward to the next 6 months from there. And then we just continue to repeat that process while the student's with us.
Yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, oh, go ahead,
Go
William.
on.
No, go.
Part of the problem, I think, that in a public school, you get all this assessment data, and then we end up with some IEPs that are 50 and 60 pages long because there are so many goal areas for our kids. And what we're able to do a little bit better is to kind of really narrow in, like Beth said,
Triage.
we can triage, like what's first, what's second,
Mhm.
and like what Christy, they keep going back to it. I mean, that the problem with the IEP process, it happens once a year.
Right.
We're
But then
in
you
a
have 20
position-
things in there, and it's like, you can't do all those things.
No,
It's just not possible,
And then you revisit it a year later. And
Yeah.
so what we're able to do, we have time on task. We can go and revisit this all the time. We're always progress monitoring. We're always trying to figure out what's next. Once I've mastered this goal, what can I go on to the following? And so we have that time to continually assess our kids and understand and better understand them.
which is a real gift, that you all are kind of in, continuous feedback mode, not to borrow a phrase from anyone. But
No, but we are. I mean, I echo everyone's sentiments. I mean, I was saying to a family earlier today who asked me, what if I could wave a magic wand, what it would be at my program. And these are not my words, I've basically taken them, but we take the IEP and we deliver it, and then we try and give more services if you need them, but we're strength-based, right? So we are basically giving kids and having them master a skill or a certain program. And there's so much more to that program, right? Like you could go in depth with it, but we want them to master what they master so that they can go into the real world and be really successful. Like there's so much more that we could teach them as teachers, and we want to, but we want them to master what we want them to master to be successful in life. And I think that it really, hits home. Like the IEP is the IEP. We'll give you the services. We'll do more, at least at Shrub Oak. And, it's really about kind of pushing you forward. So that's at least how we approach it.
And here at American School for the Deaf, generally we take the IEP that is the last written one, and we implement what we can, again, unless it's completely out of left field. But then we require a 30-day PPT to review, and then oftentimes we will completely transform most of the time in this environment. So that's kind of our
with your
process here.
understanding of the child after having had that, 30 days of experience,
Correct.
which is great, Wonderful. Well, we are coming up on 1 hour, and I really appreciate every one of you joining us tonight for this really incredibly insightful discussion. I mean, like I said, I learned something new every time. Not that I'm an expert by any means, but I learned something new about this process, about special education, about how parents move through the process every time I do one of these. And I'm blessed with all of your expertise. So, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I will provide a recording of this, and I'm going to attempt, Paula, actually, I'm going to email you afterwards to provide an ASL interpretation of this webinar to be distributed to anyone who's interested. But thank you all so much for, for attending, for listening, for your great questions, and for your expertise and insight. Everyone be well.
Christine, thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.